Welcome on board, ladies and gentlemen. Let me just adjust this. Okay. This is a reading from 1927 by Sigmund Freud, taken from Christopher Hitchens' The Portable Atheist. And I'll read, I'll read Hitchens' introduction to this text, which goes as follows. Richard Wollheim once described Sigmund Freud's work as an essay in the deafness of the mind. And whatever we may now think about the father of modern psychology, it is impossible not to regard his insights into the unconscious as seminal and revolutionary. Fascinated by totem and taboo, and by the manacles that the mind forges for itself, Freud here subjects religious belief to a calm and even quite sympathetic, if pitying, diagnosis. That's a terrific introduction. Freud is calm, even quite sympathetic, if pitying towards religion. And I'm religious, of course, but I think it's really helpful to destroy unuseful ideas of God, and helps us strengthen any mysticism that remains. Remember, Nietzsche, or Bataille, started a religion of Nietzsche, or at least a religion inspired by the death of so many gods by Nietzsche. Just a quick hello to Ling Mei as well. Well, happy birthday to you, Ling Mei, and give all my love to Kaohsiung and Taiwan. So let's start with Freud's essay from 1927. It's not so long, and I'd like to read a little bit more about Freud from Richard Rorty's Contingency, Irony, Solidarity. Fantastic text. As well as something that Freud wrote earlier. Freud wrote very early on in his life, or earlier on in his career in the late 1800s, about the obsessive-compulsive nature of religion. So we'll deal with that as well. So let's get going with The Future of an Illusion, which is from section 6 of this book. Freud wrote, I think we have prepared the way sufficiently for an answer to both these questions. It will be found if we turn our attention to the psychical origin of religious ideas. These, which are given out as teachings, are not precipitates of experience or end results of thinking. They are illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind. The secret of their strength lies in the strength of those wishes. As we already know, the terrifying impression of helplessness in childhood aroused the need for protection through love, which was provided by the father, and the recognition this helplessness lasts throughout life. And the recognition that this helplessness lasts throughout life made it necessary to cling to the existence of a father, but this time a more powerful one. Thus the benevolent rule of a divine providence allays our fear of the dangers of life. The establishment of a moral world order ensures the fulfillment of the demands of justice, which has so often remained unfulfilled in human civilization, and the prolongation of earthly existence in a future life provides the local and temporal framework in which these wish fulfillments shall take place. Answers to the riddles that tempt the curiosity of man, such as how the universe began, or what the relation is between body and mind, are developed in conformity with the underlying assumptions of this system. It is an enormous relief to the individual psyche if the conflicts of its childhood arising from the father complex, conflicts which it has never wholly overcome, are removed from it and brought to a solution which is universally accepted. When I say that these things are illusions, I must define the meaning of the word. An illusion is not the same thing as an error, nor is it necessarily an error. Aristotle's belief that vermin are developed out of dung, a belief to which ignorant people still cling, was an error. So was the belief of a former generation of doctors that tabes dorsalis is like the later stage of syphilis, where you become mad, I believe, is the result of sexual excess. So was the former belief of a former generation of doctor that tabes dorsalis is the result of sexual excess. It would be incorrect to call these errors illusions. On the other hand, it was an illusion of Columbus's that he had discovered a new sea route in the Indies. The part played by his wish in this error is very clear. One may describe as an illusion the assertion made by certain nationalists that the Indo-Germanic race is the only one capable of civilization, or the belief, which was only destroyed by psychoanalysis, that children are creatures without sexuality. What is characteristic of illusions is that they are derived from human wishes. In this respect, they come near to psychiatric delusions, but they differ from them too, apart from the more complicated structure of delusions. In the case of delusions, we emphasize as essential their being in contradiction with reality. Illusions need not necessarily be false, that is to say, unrealizable, or in contradiction to reality. For instance, a middle-class girl may have the illusion that a prince will come and marry her. This is possible, and such cases have occurred. That the Messiah will come and found a golden age is much less likely. Whether one classifies this belief as an illusion or as something analogous to a delusion will depend on one's personal attitude. Examples of illusions which have proved true are not easy to find, but the illusion of the alchemists that all metal can be turned into gold might be one of them. This has quite recently been verified as more or less true. You can pretty much turn most metals into gold. The point of doing it is reduced to rubble when you take into account the fact that it would cost a great deal of money more than the actual gold produced to make the gold. But mercury you can certainly produce gold from if you begin the process of nuclear fission. The wish to have a great deal of gold, as much gold as possible, has, it is true, been a good deal damped by our present-day knowledge of the determinants of wealth, but chemistry no longer regards the transmutation of metals into gold as impossible. Thus we call a belief an illusion, when a wish fulfillment is a prominent factor in its motivation, and in doing so we disregard its relations to reality, just as the illusion itself sets no store by verification. Freud probably still hated what I follow, what I believe, or some kind of faith that I have, which might look completely threadbare and minimal, and to Freud. But I always feel a strong demand to investigate religious ideas, spiritual ideas, and attach yourself to ones that you find useful but not convenient. That way, transcending the possibility of getting involved in spiritual ideas just through wish fulfillment for the looking of a divine father figure, as Freud argues. Having thus taken our bearings, let us return once more to the question of religious doctrines. We can now repeat that all of them are illusions and insusceptible to proof. No one can be compelled to think them true, to believe in them. Some of them are so improbable, so incompatible with everything we have laboriously discovered about the reality of the world, that we may compare them, if we pay proper regard to the psychological differences, to delusions. Of the reality value of most of them, we cannot judge, just as they cannot be proved, so they cannot be refuted. This is I think Karl Popper came later in the 40s, I'm not sure, but Karl Popper said that science has strong claims, religion doesn't. The fact that you can claim something to be false is part of science's strength. So science is falsifiable, has claims that are strong, and religious claims are not falsifiable. So read your horoscope and it's hard to actually prove it wrong. But the whole weakness of superstitious ideas is they are not falsifiable. No one can be compelled to think such religious ideas as true, to believe in them. Some of them are so improbable, so incompatible with everything we have laboriously discovered about the world, that we may compare them, if we pay proper regard to the psychological differences, to delusions. Of the reality value of most of them we cannot judge, just as they cannot be proved, so they cannot be refuted. So the fact that something can't be wrong is a real weakness. So strictly speaking, many religious truths can't be wrong because they can't be falsified. But that's no strength in any way. We still know too little to make a critical approach to them. Bearing in mind all this lack of knowledge at the moment about corona, of course we see conflicting reports. I remember telling people, chill out, relax, about 3-4 weeks ago, relax, it's not even a flu, it's a strong cold. I read that in places like the New Statesman, in respected places. It's wrong. It's just absolutely wrong. The claim that COVID-19 is like a mild for a strong flu is wrong, but to certain reports at the time it may have appeared correct, given that there are only reports of it being like a strong flu. So the idea is that science always has to shed its falsities and eternally renew itself in the process of scientific verification. We still know too little to make a critical approach to them or to religious doctrines. The riddles of the universe reveal themselves only slowly to our investigation. There are many questions to which science today can give no answer. But scientific work is the only road which can lead us to a knowledge of reality outside of ourselves. Let me read that again. Scientific work is the only road which can lead us to a knowledge of reality outside ourselves. It is once again merely an illusion to expect anything from intuition and introspection. They can give us nothing but particulars about our own mental life, which are hard to interpret, never any information about the questions which religious doctrine finds it so easy to answer. It would be insolent to let one's own arbitrary will step into the breach and, according to one's personal estimate, declare that this or that part of the religious system to be less or more acceptable. Some questions are too momentous for that. They might be called too sacred. The question in my mind is whether you can carry out religious thinking without being involved in metaphysics. This might sound like a really dull and uninteresting thing to follow, but if you truly believe that the only reality you can see is in yourself, or you're very doubtful of an external structure of reality, is there still a place for religion? I'm surprised Freud is quite so strong against this, as the way he understands religion to be a way of meaning making. And he says religion always has the easiest answers about questions which we find hardest to answer in life. That strikes me also as quite strange. I think Judaism, he of course was a Jew, or not a practicing, but from a Jewish family. It's surprising that he might say that, given that Judaism is has many traditions that really value mystery. And there are two things here. If a rabbi gives you a mysterious answer to a difficult question, is he evading the actually getting into the question, or does he possess actually some deeper knowledge and intuition of the situation? All you can say for sure is mystics absolutely love paradoxes. It's a way of getting beyond words, using a language that isn't or using a kind of vocabulary that's not exactly spoken. I'll continue. At this point, one must expect to meet with an objection. Well then, if even obdurate skeptics admit that the assertions of religion cannot be refuted by reason, why should I not believe in them, since they have so much on their side: tradition, the agreement of mankind, and all the consolation they offer. Well, why not indeed, asks Freud. Just as no one can be forced to believe, so no one can be forced to disbelieve. But do not let us be satisfied with deceiving ourselves that arguments like these take us along the road of correct thinking. If ever there was a case of a lame excuse, we have it here. Ignorance is ignorance. No right to believe anything can be derived from it. In other matters, no sensible person will behave so irresponsibly or rest content with such feeble grounds for his opinions and for the line he takes. It is only in the highest and most sacred things that he allows himself to do so. In reality, these are only attempts as pretending to oneself or to other people that one is still firmly attached to religion, when one has long since cut oneself loose from it. Where questions of religion are concerned, people are guilty of every possible sort of dishonesty and intellectual misdemeanour. Philosophers stretch the meaning of words until they retain scarcely anything of their original sense. I bring to mind some of the French continental philosophers who had a very certain, like Derrida, Barthes, who had a very strong Catholic presence in their lives, who couldn't shed this love of mystery. Philosophers stretch the meaning of words until they retain scarcely anything of their original sense. They give the name of God to some vague abstraction which they have created for themselves. Having done so, they can pose before all the world as deists, as believers in God, and they can even boast that they have recognized a higher, purer concept of God, notwithstanding that their God is now nothing more than an insubstantial shadow and no longer the mighty personality of religious doctrines. This is the danger, of course, of deists. Deists are people who believe that maybe it wasn't God who created the world, and maybe God isn't part of everyday single action in the world. God is merely a shadow, according to Freud. What I call a minimal, threadbare God. Some vague abstraction that Freud criticizes. No longer the mighty personality of religious doctrines. Critics persist in describing as deeply religious anyone who admits to a sense of man's insignificance or impotence in the face of the universe. Although what constitutes the essence of the religious attitude is not this feeling, but only the next step after it. The reaction to it, which seeks a remedy for it. The man who goes no further but humbly acquiesces in the small part which human beings play in the world, such a man is, on the contrary, irreligious in the truest sense of the word. To assess the truth value of religious doctrines does not lie within the scope of the present inquiry. It is enough for us that we have recognized them as being, in their psychological nature, illusions. But we do not have to conceal the fact that this discovery also strongly influences our attitude to the question which must appear to many to be the most important of all. We know approximately at what periods and by what kind of men religious doctrines which were created. Let me just read that again. We know approximately at what periods and by what kind of men religious doctrines were created. If in addition we discover the motives which led to this, our attitude to the problem of religion will undergo a marked displacement. We shall tell ourselves that it would be very nice if there were a God who created the world and was a benevolent providence, and if there were a moral order in the universe and an afterlife. But it is a very striking fact that all this is exactly as we are bound to wish it to be. And it would be more remarkable still if our wretched, ignorant, and downtrodden ancestors had succeeded in solving all these difficult riddles of the universe. Section 7. Having recognized religious doctrines as illusions, we are at once faced by a further question. May not other cultural assets of which we hold a higher opinion and by which we let our lives be ruled be of a similar nature? Must not the assumptions that determine our political regulations be called illusions as well? And is it not the case that in our civilization, the relations between the sexes are disturbed by an erotic illusion or a number of such illusions? And once our suspicion has been aroused, we shall not shrink from asking too whether our conviction that we can learn something about external reality through the use of observation and reasoning in scientific work, whether this conviction has any better foundation. Nothing ought to keep us from directing our observation to our own selves, or from applying our thought to criticism of itself. In this field, a number of investigations open out before us, whose results could not but be decisive for the construction of the Weltanschauung. Weltanschauung is a concept I haven't arrived at for a very long time, but I think it's an overriding world worldview. Weltanschauung, something like view. I'm not so sure. Weltanschauung in German. We surmise, moreover, that such an effort would not be wasted, and that it would at least in part justify our suspicion. But the author does not dispose of the means for undertaking so comprehensive a task. He needs must confine his work to following out one only of these illusions, that namely of religion. But now the loud voice of our opponent brings us to a halt. We are called to account for our wrongdoing. Archaeological interests are no doubt most praiseworthy, but no one undertakes an excavation if by doing so he is going to undermine the habitations of the living, so that they collapse and bury people under their ruins. The doctrines of religion are not a subject one can quibble about like any other. Our civilization is built up on them, and the maintenance of human society is based on the majority of men's believing in the truth of these doctrines. If men are taught that there is no almighty and all-just God, no divine world order, and no future life, they will feel exempt from all obligation to obey the precepts of civilization. Everyone will, without inhibition or fear, follow his asocial, egoistic instincts and seek to exercise his power, chaos, which we have banished through many thousands of years to the work of civilization, will come again, like Dostoevsky's "If God is not real, everything is permitted." Even if we knew and could prove that religion was not in possession of the truth, we ought to conceal the fact and behave in the way prescribed by the philosophy of as if. And this in the interest of the preservation of us all. And apart from the danger of the undertaking, it will be a purposeless cruelty. Countless people find their one consolation in religious doctrines, and can only bear life with their help. You would rob them of their support, without having anything better to give them in exchange. It is admitted that so far science has not achieved much, but even if it had advanced much further, it would not suffice for man. Man has imperative needs of another sort, which can never be satisfied by cold science, and it is very strange, indeed it is the height of inconsistency, that a psychologist who has always insisted on what a minor part is played in human affairs by the intelligence as compared with the life of the instincts, that such a psychologist should now try to rob mankind of a precious wish fulfillment, and should propose to compensate them for it with intellectual nourishment. Keep religion in the background, on the back burner. If you get rid of it, you will destroy so many people's emotional well-being, is the claim put here for Freud to deal with. What a lot of accusations all at once. Nevertheless, I am ready with rebuttals for them all. And what is more, I shall assert the view that civilization runs a greater risk if we maintain our present attitude to religion than if we give it up. But I hardly know where to begin my reply. Perhaps with the assurance that I myself regard my undertaking as completely harmless and free of risk. It is not I who am overvaluing the intellect this time. If people are, as my opponents describe themselves, and I should not like to contradict them, then there is no danger of a devout believer's being overcome by my arguments and deprived of his faith. Besides, I have said nothing which other and better men have not said before me in a much more complete, forcible, and impressive manner. Their names are well known, and I shall not cite them, for I should not like to give an impression that I am seeking to rank myself as one of them. All I have done, and this is the only thing that is new in my exposition, is to add some psychological foundation to the criticisms of my great predecessors. The book, The Portable Atheist, actually starts with Lucretius, Lucretius, the Roman philosopher, if I'm not mistaken. It is hardly to be expected that precisely this edition will produce the effect which was denied to those earlier efforts. No doubt I might be asked here, what is the point of writing these things if I am certain that they will be ineffective? But I shall come back to that later. The one person this publication may injure is myself. I shall have to listen to the most disagreeable reproaches for my shallowness, narrow-mindedness, and lack of idealism, or of understanding for the highest interests of mankind. But on the one hand, such remonstrances are not new to me, and on the other, if a man has already learnt in his youth to rise superior to the disapproval of his contemporaries, what can it matter to him in his old age, when he is certain soon to be beyond the reach of all favour or disfavour? In former times it was different. Then utterances such as mine brought with them a sure curtailment of one's earthly existence and an effective speeding up of the opportunity for gaining a personal experience to the afterlife. But I repeat, those times are past, and today writings such as this bring no more danger to their author than to their readers. The most that can happen is that the translation and distribution of his book will be forgiven in one country or another, and precisely, of course, in a country that is convinced of the high standard of its culture. But if one puts in any plea at all for the renunciation of wishes and for acquiescence in fate, with a capital F, one must be able to tolerate this journey, this kind of injury too. He will get there eventually. Continuing. The further question occurred to me whether the publication of this work might not after all do harm, not to a person, however, but to a cause, the cause of psychoanalysis. For it cannot be denied that psychoanalysis is my creation, and it has met with plenty of mistrust and ill will. We have to remember Freud was a celebrity. By the 1920s, he was a public intellectual. People knew him, and they knew even what he looked like. If I now come forward with such displeasing pronouncements, people will be only too ready to make a displacement from my person to psychoanalysis. Now we see, they will say, where psychoanalysis leads to. The mask has fallen. It leads to the denial of God and of a moral ideal, as we always suspected. Freud was telling people that children had their own forms of sexuality, and that all women desired to have a penis, and that all men had these crazy mythic tales spinning around them. The things he was saying were not comfortable. The mask has fallen. It leads to a denial of God and a moral ideal, as he's got this imaginary critic telling him. To keep us from this discovery, we have been deluded into thinking that psychoanalysis has no Weltanschauung and never can construct one. Freud continues, an outcry of this kind will really be disagreeable to me on account of my many fellow workers. Thinking about Jung, who comes later, who brings in myth and religion, of course. Some of whom do not by any means share my attitude to the problems of religion. But psychoanalysis has already weathered many storms, and now it must brave this fresh one. In point of fact, psychoanalysis is a method of research, an impartial instrument, like the infinitesimal calculus, as it were. If a physicist were to discover with the latter's help that after a certain time the earth would be destroyed, we would nevertheless hesitate to attribute destructive tendencies to the calculus itself and therefore to prescribe it. Nothing that I have said here against the truth value of religions needed the support of psychoanalysis. It has been said by others long before analysis came into existence. If the application of the psychoanalytic method makes it possible to find a new argument against the truths of religion, tant pis for religion, tant pis for religion, but defenders of religion will by the same right make use of psychoanalysis in order to give full value to the effective significance of religious doctrines. And now to proceed with our defence. Religion has clearly performed great services for human civilization. It has contributed much towards the taming of the asocial instincts, but not enough. It has ruled human society for many thousands of years and has had time to show what it can achieve. If it had succeeded in making the majority of mankind happy, in comforting them, in reconciling them to life, and in making them into vehicles of civilization, no one would dream of attempting to alter the existing conditions. But what do we see instead? We see that an appallingly large number of people are dissatisfied with civilization and unhappy in it, and to feel it as a yoke which must be shaken off. Yoke, of course, is related to the word yoga. And that these people either do everything in their power to change that civilization, or else go so far in their hostility to it that they will have nothing to do with civilization, or with the restriction of instinct. At this point, it will be objected against us that this state of affairs is due to the very fact that religion has lost a part of its influence over human masses precisely because of the deplorable effect of the advances of science. We will note this admission and the reason given for it, and we shall make use of it later for our own purposes, but the objection itself has no force. It is doubtful whether men were in general happier at a time when religious doctrines held unrestricted sway. More morals they certainly were not. They have always known how to externalize the precepts of religion and thus to nullify their intentions. The priests, whose duty it was to ensure obedience to religion, met them halfway in this. God's kindness must lay a restraining hand on his justice. One sinned, and then one made a One sinned, and then one made a sacrifice or did penance, and then one was free to sin once more. Russian introspectiveness has reached the pitch of concluding that sin is indispensable for the enjoyment of all the blessings of divine grace, so that, at bottom, sin is pleasing to God. It is no secret that the priests could only keep the masses submissive to religion by making such large concessions as these to the instinctual nature of man. That's a little bit getting towards what Bataille says. He makes an extreme claim here. He's so to speak, a philosopher of distortion. He says that transgression, taboo, are implicitly condoned by religious leaders as a component of keeping the doctrine sustained, or sustaining the doctrine by having its contradiction. And at certain points in the year, maybe once a year, carnival, so on and so forth, you're allowed to transgress, you're allowed to drown in the taboo. It is no secret that priests could only keep masses submissive to religion by making such large concessions as these to the instinctual nature of man. Thus it was agreed, God alone is strong and good, man is weak and sinful. In every age, immorality has found no less support in religion than morality has. If the achievements of religion in respect to man's happiness, susceptibility to culture and moral control are no better than this, the question cannot but arise whether we are not overrating its necessity for mankind, and whether we do wisely in basing our cultural demands upon it. Bataille also mentions in Eroticism, in the chapter on transgression, no sooner does God give Moses the 10 Commandments, and one of them, of course, thou shalt not kill, than he also commands his people to war. Here is the doctrine, and here's where we're going to transgress it. Let us consider the unmistakable situation as it is today. We have heard the admission that religion no longer has the same influence on people that it used to. We are here concerned with European Christian civilization. And this is not because its promises have grown less, but because people find them less credible. Let us admit that the reason, though perhaps not the only reason, for this change is the increase in the scientific spirit in the higher strata of human society. Criticism has whittled away the evidential value of religious documents. Natural science has shown up the errors in them, and comparative research has been struck by the fatal resemblance between the religious ideas which we revere and the mental products of primitive people and times. The scientific spirit brings about a particular attitude towards worldly matters. Before religious matters, it pauses for a little, hesitates, and finally, there too, crosses the threshold. In this process, there is no stopping. The greater the number of men to whom the treasures of knowledge become accessible, the more widespread is the falling away from religious belief. At first only from its obsolete and objectionable trappings, but later from its fundamental postulates as well. The Americans who instituted the monkey trial at Dayton have alone shown themselves consistent. Elsewhere, the inevitable transition is accomplished by way of half measures and insincerities. Civilization has little to fear from educated people and brain workers. In them, the replacement of religious motives for civilized behaviour by other secular motives would proceed unobtrusively. Moreover, such people are to a large extent themselves vehicles of civilization. But it is another matter with the great mass of the uneducated and oppressed, who have every reason for being enemies of civilization. So long as they do not discover that people no longer believe in God, all is well, but they will discover it infallibly, even if this piece of writing of mine is not published. And they are ready to accept the results of scientific thinking, but without the change having taken place in them through scientific thinking. But without the change having taken place in them, which scientific thinking brings about in people. Is there not a danger here that the hostility of these masses to civilization will throw itself against the weak spots that they have found in their task mistress? If the sole reason why you must not kill your neighbour is because God has forbidden it, and will severely punish you for it in this or the next life, then when you learn that there is no God, and that you need not fear his punishment, you will certainly kill your neighbour without hesitation, and you can only be prevented from doing so by mundane force. Thus either these dangerous masses must be held down most severely and kept most carefully away from any chance of intellectual awakening, or else the relationship between civilization and religion must undergo a fundamental revision. So that's the end of that essay. I just want to quickly cite or just quote one or two things from a previous essay, a much earlier essay of Freud's, which is called Obsessive Acts and Religious Practices. He compares obsessive-compulsive behaviour with religion. So tidying your bed, excessively washing your hands, to that of upholding religious doctrines. And I've actually lost my place here, as you can tell. So if you just give me a few seconds, I'll try to make it. It is easy to see wherein lies the resemblance between neurotic ceremonial and religious rites. It is in the fear of pangs of conscience after their omission, in the complete isolation of them from all other activities, the feeling that one must not be disturbed, and in the conscientiousness with which the details are carried out. It's not just that the two resemble each other, that the two may be part of the same thing of appeasing the superego, the third part of the mind's components, according to Freud, that you're pleasingly clean, a hyper socially conscious part of the brain in order to be pure, in order to please some deeper instinct. It's that these things are carried out with a hard-working nature that they are, of course, conscientious. But equally obvious are the differences, some of which are so startling that they make the comparison into a sacrilege. The greater individual variability of neurotic ceremonial in contrast with the stereotyped character of rites, prayer, and orientation, thinking of the call to prayer 5 times a day, thinking of the prayers that Orthodox Jews give throughout the day, thinking of the prohibition of work during the Sabbath from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. Thinking of asking, is it a goyim, a non-Jew, to perform acts of labour for Jews during the Sabbath, this excessive cleanliness. Its private nature as opposed to the public and communal nature or character of religious observances, especially, however, the distinctions that the little details of religious ceremonies are full of meaning and are understood symbolically, while those of neurotics seem silly and meaningless. In this respect, an obsessional neurosis furnishes a tragicomic travesty. Dearie me. In this respect, an obsessional neurosis furnishes a tragicomic travesty of a private religion of obsession compulsion. But this, the sharpest distinction between neurotic and religious ceremonials, disappears as soon as one penetrates by means of psychoanalytic investigation to insight into obsessive actions. By this process, the outward appearance of being foolish and meaningless, which is characteristic of obsessive acts, is completely demolished, and the fact of their having this appearance is explained. It is found that obsessive acts are throughout and in all their detail full of meaning, that they serve important interests to the personality, and that they give expression both to persisting impressions of previous experiences and to thoughts about them which are strongly charged with affect. This they do in 2 ways, either by direct or by symbolic representation, so that they are interpreted either historically or symbolically. A girl of my acquaintance was under the compulsion to rinse out the basin many times after washing. The significance of this ceremonial lay in the proverbial saying, "Don't throw away dirty water until you have clean." The action had the meaning of a warning to her sister, to whom she was much attached, not to separate from her unsatisfactory husband until she had established with a better man. A woman who was living apart from her husband was this is a second subject, was compelled to leave the best of whatever she ate. For example, she would only take the outside of a piece of roast meat. This renunciation was explained by the date of its origin. It appeared the day after she had refused marital relations with her husband, that is to say, had given up the best. The same patient could only sit on one particular chair, and could leave it again only with difficulty. In connection with certain details of her married life, the chair symbolized to her her husband, to whom she remained faithful. She found the explanation of her compulsion in the sentence, "It is so hard to part from anything, chair or husband, in which one has settled oneself." It is one of the features of the disease that the person who is affected with a compulsion submits to it without understanding its meaning. This is the idea that, for me, therapy starts with awareness. Once you're aware of something, once you shine light on something, the body knows how to fix it by itself, with the help of myth. It is one of the features of the disease that the person who is affected with a compulsion submits to it without understanding its meaning, or at any rate its chief meaning. It is only under the influence of psychoanalytic treatment that the meaning of the obsessive act, and therewith of the impelling motive underlying it, becomes conscious. We express this important fact by saying that the obsessive act serves to express unconscious motives and ideas. Here we seem to find a further departure from religious rites, but we must remember that, as a rule, the ordinary religious observer carries out a ceremonial without concerning himself with its significance, although priests and investigators may be familiar with its meaning, which is usually symbolic. In all believers, however, the motives impelling them to religious practices are unknown, or are replaced in consciousness by others who are advanced in their stead. You allow the priest to do the thinking for you. He talks quite well about how obsessive compulsive patients he's worked with have this drive to constantly making the bed. And the way he describes it is very much in parallel with the kneeling in a church, the submission to the priest's voice, submission to unconscious as well, unconscious submission. This is the really important thing. Not only are these people extremely determined to carry out these acts with regularity and a conscientiousness, but they do so without really investigating the origins of doing it, or at least abnegating that responsibility to a religious figure, the father, of course. I'm surprised, however, that Freud didn't consider religious myth as a way of helping us understand the world and construct our own myths, and a way of dispelling psychoses or neuroses. And, of course, that was picked up later by his student Carl Jung. And the ability for religious myth to create stories and to unravel psychic trauma is referenced or hinted at by Richard Rorty in Contingency, Irony and Solidarity. I've got a little bookmark over the title there because it's an ex-library book from the University of Wolverhampton. So I'm just going to read a couple of passages from Richard Rorty, and then we shall say good grief and good morning, I guess. And to me, the destruction of gods, the criticism of religions only, for me, strengthens this, yes, minimal and threadbare approach I have to spirituality. And it actually reinforces what you believe in. I think it's really worth to read the authors that you are supposed to. You may feel you disagree with, but in a way you kind of resonate with them into kind of opposites attract sense. And Rorty is so valuable for outlining what Freud opened up for humanity, for us to write our own narratives, to become poetic philosophers or poet philosophers. Freud writes, Richard Rorty in the chapter Contingency of Selfhood, in my copy it's page 32. Freud shows us why we deplore cruelty in some cases and relish it in others. He shows us why our ability to love is restricted to some very particular shapes and sizes and colours of people, things or ideas. He shows us why our sense of guilt is aroused by certain very specific and, in theory, quite minor events, and not by others which, on any familiar moral theory, would loom much larger. Further, he gives each of us the equipment to construct our own private vocabulary of moral deliberation. He gives each of us the equipment to construct our own private vocabulary of moral deliberation. For terms like infantile or sadistic or obsessional or paranoid, unlike the names of vices and virtues which we inherit from the Greeks and the Christians, have very specific and very different resonances for each individual who uses them. They bring to our minds resemblances and differences between ourselves and very particular people, our parents, for example, and between the present situation and very particular situations of our past. They enable us to sketch a narrative of our own development, our own idiosyncratic moral struggle, which is far more finely textured, far more custom-tailored to our individual case, than the moral vocabulary which the philosophical tradition offered us. One could sum up this point by saying that Freud makes moral deliberation just as finely grained, just as detailed, and as multiform as prudential calculation has always been. He thereby breaks down the distinction between moral guilt and practical inadvisability, thereby blurring the prudence-morality distinction. Freud spends his time exhibiting the extraordinary sophistication, subtlety, and wit of our unconscious strategies. He thereby makes it possible for us to see science and poetry, genius and psychosis, and more importantly, morality and prudence, not as products of distinct faculties, but as alternative modes of adaptation. In a way, couldn't you include religious myth here? Not religious doctrine, but myth, storytelling. You can symbolically kill or deal blows with hammers to God, yet still discuss the myth of the Tower of Babel, Garden of Eden, as simple stories. Why should we presume we know the God they were talking about in these myths? Freud thus helps us to take seriously the possibility that there is no central faculty, no central self called reason, and thus to take Nietzschean pragmatism and perspectivalism seriously. Freudian moral psychology gives us a vocabulary for self-redescription which is radically different from Plato's, and also radically different from that side of Nietzsche which Heidegger rightly condemned as one more example of inverted Platonism, the romantic attempt to exalt the flesh over the spirit, the heart over the head, a mythical faculty called will over the equally mythic one called reason. Here we get to it. The Platonic and Kantian idea of rationality centers around the idea that we need to bring particular actions under general principles if we are to be moral. Freud suggests that we need to return to the particular, to see particular present situations and options as similar to or different from particular past actions or events. In the previous two stories mentioned, it was the choice of a particular chair or the washing of a particular bowl. But for me, it could be a particular symbol which arises out of meditation, symbols that the body pours out, vomits, so to speak, seeps and allows to flow. What do these symbols mean? What are they trying to say? Freud suggests we need to return to the particular. He thinks that only if we catch hold of some crucial idiosyncratic contingencies in our past shall we be able to make something worthwhile out of ourselves, to create present selves whom we can respect. He taught us to interpret what we are doing or thinking of doing in terms of, for example, our past reaction to particular authority figures, or in terms of constellations of behavior which were forced upon us in infancy. He suggests that we praise ourselves by weaving idiosyncratic narratives, case histories, as it were, of our success in self-creation, our ability to break free from an idiosyncratic past. He suggests that we condemn ourselves for failure to break free of that past, rather than for failure to live up to universal standards. That's all from me. I will see you all at 4 p.m. for Hodorowski's Tarot, and we're going to deal with temperance. Thank you very much.